Hi everyone, and welcome to another GraphCMS Talks. I don't need to give much of an introduction to Preston because, I mean, from Gatsby and Acquia and now to Oracle, you're no stranger to headless architectures and API-first digital experiences. So why don't you kick us off with a really quick insight into who you are and tell us who Preston is?
Sure. Thanks, Ronak, and thank you so much for having me here on this episode of GraphCMS Talks. It's a real pleasure to be joining you all today. My name is Preston So. My pronouns are he, him. I work currently at Oracle, working on the developer experience for Oracle Content Management, but I've been in the content space for about 15 or so years now, which is a really long time to be in the content space. I started out in web design, went over to content management, but recently I've been spending a lot of my time in headless CMS architectures and specifically around some of these new experiences beyond the web that all of us are trying to support with our content management systems. So I've written several books on this topic. The first is Decoupled Drupal in Practice, which came out about 3 years ago. I've also got a book, it's by the way, the only book about decoupled Drupal that's comprehensive on the market. I've also written Gatsby, the Definitive Guide, which is coming out this fall and is already available from O'Reilly in early release. And finally, I wrote just recently a book called Voice Content and Usability with a Book Apart, which is coming out June 22nd and is already available for pre-order, which is really about how to take our content that's trapped on websites and really orient it towards the web, towards voice interfaces and conversational interfaces, and a lot of these new experiences that go well beyond the trappings or the limitations of the web. But I do a lot of different things, as you know, Ronak. I go, I jump around from the developer experience to the designer kind of area over to a lot of work with content teams. And I've worked on all sides of the equation when it comes to content. So I'm no stranger to content architectures.
Right, and just for context, I know that you and I started speaking relatively recently about decoupled days and also voice, because voice is something that I personally have a bit of an interest in, and I'd like to explore that a bit more as we go ahead. But just to kick things off with something relatively light, you've been involved in content strategy for a really long time, and if you just sort of look back at everything you've done so far, how have you seen these content needs change over time? What are some of the sort of benefits and pitfalls you're seeing with more and more organizations moving from the classical web CMS, not only to headless CMSs, but the whole digital experience platform side of things?
Absolutely, and it's a great question. To preface that, I'll share that what you just mentioned around decoupled days. We've got a conference coming up. It's the only nonprofit, volunteer-led headless CMS conference in the entire world, taking place July 14th through 15th, decoupled days. We usually have it in New York City. It's going to be virtual this year. And we have some amazing sessions this year. So I definitely want to encourage everyone to check out decoupleddays.com. When it comes to digital experience platforms and some of these issues around moving from, let's say, a primarily web-based CMS over to a CMS that's more appropriate for more pageless experiences, like we like to say at Oracle, I think there's a lot to think about. I've done a lot of writing on this subject, not only on my blog at Preston.so, but also on CMS Wire about some of these things in my quarterly column about why it is that the digital experience platform and some of the things that we talk about when it comes to CMS can't leave behind some of the most important users of those CMSs. And those are people who are not developers. I think one of the things that we saw with the initial wave of content management architectures and the first, let's say, entry of CMSs into the market, this is back in the days when it was primarily about blogging tools or discussion board tools, back in the days of PHP BB or movable type, some of these very early CMSs that were there. Back in those days, I think we almost went a little bit too far in the direction of the web. And what I mean by that is there are certain motifs and certain tropes of the web that we see all the time and that we use on a regular basis. Links, calls to action, lead generation forms, subscribe to newsletter forms. But all of these things are very rooted in and very couched in the notion of what a website does with our content. And one of the problems that I've seen over the past few years especially is that this bias, this leaning toward the web, has actually disadvantaged us in certain ways. Because back in those days, we forged as a market, as an industry, what I like to call a grand compromise between the developers building a lot of these websites based on templates and themes, and a lot of the front-end development that took place in those days focused on delivering content into these really nice boilerplates and templates. and shifting also a lot of power over to those who are designers, those who are content editors, those who are content teams and marketers and content strategists, to be able to introspect and preview and work with their content in really rich ways. Now, of course, the problem with this grand compromise, so to speak, which I wrote about quite extensively in CMS Wire, is the fact that this compromise was very much rooted in the web. And the web is no longer the only destination for our content. And it's clear that we can't just have necessarily a website that ties into a single CMS like we used to. There's no way to couple these architectures anymore in the way that we used to. So I think one of the big challenges right now is when we think about digital experience platforms, I like to think about them more so from the context of orchestrating digital experiences beyond the web, as opposed to micromanaging them, which is what I think a lot of people got used to from this first generation of CMSs. So when it comes to voice content especially, it's very important for us to think about how do we actually look at administering this content in a way that makes sense, in the same way that it makes sense to actually administer a website, but without all of those architectural vestigial features that have manifested over the years from the fact that we worked in the web for such a long period of time, and is really the basis on which a lot of our content management practices and content strategy principles are built.
Right. And no, I did read that article where you sort of go away from the whole digital experience management to orchestration, and I thought it was really interesting. And so if I take that and I take what you said about, how you treat things as page-based and non-page-based at Oracle, I think it's a really interesting sort of way to talk about digital experiences today, because it's really not about the website or the desktop. It's also not about the mobile app. I mean, you've got watches, you've got dishwashers, you've got TVs. There's tons of displays in which companies can interact with their customers and their audiences, and they're really starting to understand the difference between an omnichannel approach and just a cross-platform approach, which is what was for the longest time. So, given that you're seeing the application of content on so many formats and across so many devices. And a lot of the effectiveness of these digital experiences really comes down to the content modeling strategy and how effectively teams can create or repurpose a lot of the content infrastructure that they set into place. How are you seeing this evolution come about, where companies that have traditionally been just all about the website or the mobile device, and they now have these endless digital displays that they can interact with? How are you seeing the sort of evolution of a content modeling strategy?
Wow, that's there's a lot to unpack in that.
Sorry, that was heavy. I kind of went off on a tangent, as I do, but it's kind of like a catch-all question, I suppose. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me approach this question from two angles, because I think there's several different dimensions that we have to think about. And I'll leave the content management, the content modeling piece just to a little bit later, because we really have to start from the very beginning, which is the content strategy. Even before you think about a content model, or even before you think about how you're going to actually structure that content, make it semantically valuable, you really have to think about your content strategy. And one of the things I often talk about, and I write quite a bit about, and I actually just gave a recent presentation at Omnichannel X about this very topic, is the importance of really putting together an omni-channel content strategy even before you think about anything to do with the technology or anything to do with the underpinnings of your content. And one of the manifestations of this is the fact that everyone wants to have a single source of truth for content. And I think that's the most important thing for maintainability, for scalability when it comes to that content. You want to be able to repurpose that content. I mean, we all know, folks at Oracle and GraphCMS, we both know that the most important thing is the reusability and the portability of that content, or what some folks call the sort of modularity of that content as well. So one of the things that I am really pointing my attention towards recently is thinking about content through the lens of some of these other channels and some of these other experiences that we have to serve first and foremost. And that will educate us and inform how those content modeling practices should evolve. One of these examples is voice content, which is, of course, the subject of my book, Voice Content and Usability. And I think this is really important to think about from the context of the fact that the web, up until now, has been really rooted in, and I think this is true of both web and what we would call mobile content too, responsive websites. It's been really rooted in sitemaps, nav bars, links, these networked hub and spoke architectures where you really have this visual context and this very clear visual network that you can use, sort of like an airline route map to be able to see where you need to go at any point in time. But of course, the problem is that a lot of the digital experiences that we're now serving today with content, especially voice content experiences, as well as immersive content experiences, don't reflect this at all. One of the things I talk about in my book, Voice Content and Usability, is, well, what happens when, it's no longer a matter of navigating a sitemap or navigating links or breadcrumbs on a website, but rather it's about having a negotiation and negotiating your place in an interface with somebody else, or it's about listening through certain prompts as opposed to leafing through certain links that you might click on in quick succession. Very similarly with immersive content, there's this concern as well. Immersive content is a really emerging field right now in terms of content strategy and content design around thinking about, well, what about spatial content? What about locational content? What about content that's rooted in the physical world? I wrote a recent piece for A List Apart called Immersive Content Strategy that really delves into what people should be thinking about when it comes to the sorts of content that play in the physical sandbox, just like voice content and conversational content plays more in the oral sandbox. How do we have to shift our thinking? And in voice content and immersive content both, it's very clear that we have to completely reinvent the ways that we think about how we structure content from the standpoint of content strategy. And that means looking at, for example, the fact that voice interfaces, because they're non-visual, are linear affairs. They're unidirectional. You can't really have networking going on or hub and spoke architectures in a voice interface because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And of course, immersive content and spatial content really has to mimic the way in which you navigate the real world. So it's very much rooted in this physical sandbox, this physical manifestation of how our content should appear, which oftentimes bears absolutely no relation to websites and how they're structured, but bears far more relation to how a transportation hub is structured. Like, for example, Berlin Hauptbahnhof, right? So a lot of these issues are very important to consider, and that's why every organization I advise and I consult with, the very first thing I say is when you're looking at a voice content experience or an immersive content experience or looking to broach that liminal area beyond the web, the very first thing to think about is auditing your content and taking a look at how your content plays in all of these different sandboxes, because I can guarantee you right now, the vast majority of our content that's currently trapped in the web does not play well and does not perform well in some of these immersive or voice contexts. With content modeling, it's a whole different scenario, and it really is one of those things that's a marriage and a connecting of the dots between that developer experience and the content architecture, together with the ways in which we know that our customers and our users want to be able to navigate and experience this content. And one of the things I find really interesting is that a lot of the principles in content modeling still carry over very well, but a lot of them don't. One thing I think carries over quite well is the notion of relational content or related content or content references, where we can say, oh, hey, there's a related piece of content to this piece of content you're looking at right now. And that's a very common trope across content-driven websites. And that's the same sort of thing that could be appropriate for a voice interface. For example, in the Ask Georgia Gov project, which is the first Alexa interface for residents of the state of Georgia, I talk about this at length in my book, there's an example where we allow people to request and also access that related content and have a really seamless experience where they navigate from that core piece of content they were looking at to another related content item with a very, very clear access point. And this can happen in immersive content and spatial content as well. However, there are certain areas that are not so well suited to the realms of spoken content or spatial content. And one of those examples I would say is the way in which we write our content. If you look at the web, and you alluded to this earlier as well, Ronak, like when we write our content, we tend to sprinkle in links, we tend to sprinkle in certain calls to action. But what happens when you're in a VR interface, you're using a HoloLens or you're using a Oculus Rift and you're using an Alexa device and you can't click on, there's no way to click on a link. There's no way to actually do what the page is telling you to do, which is learn more or read more or hit here to subscribe. Those things don't exist in a context of immersive content or voice content. So when it comes to content modeling, I think it's also about the notion of when you are structuring your content, is it appropriate for some of these contexts? For a spoken context, for example, a more dialogic format, a more conversational cadence, a more back and forth sort of structure where you have A, B, as opposed to, let's say, A pointing to B, C, D, E, F. might be a much more appropriate information architecture for voice content and for immersive content as well.
No, true. And you know, a couple of minutes ago, you also mentioned about how we at Oracle and GraphCMS, we love the whole concept of this modular reusable content. But if you think about, you know, moving away and abstracting that display away when you're starting to interact with content that you can't see, things get a lot more complicated, because all of a sudden, all that structured content you had in place for your website or for your app, it could end up meaning nothing, because Alexa is not going to read a blog post to you at the end of the day. If you're looking for a product, you need to be able to deliver the content in a native format that the consumer is asking for. And I think this also touches quite a bit on, you know, the concept of being voice content ready for companies who've again never had the need to have an Alexa platform or an Alexa app or a VR app. But they slowly start to understand that, okay, I need to engage with my customers on these platforms that I have no experience with, but I can't reuse anything I have. And at the same time, I don't necessarily want to rebuild everything from scratch. So how would you advise companies like this to think a bit more about the future and be a bit more voice content ready, without necessarily having to think about the entire overhaul to their infrastructure to begin with?
It's a great question. And first thing I'll say is that chapter 2 of my book, Voice Content and Usability, basically covers this entire topic, right? Like this whole notion of this whole debate, which is inevitable and is always going to happen, between, well, should we write new content and should we create, let's say, parallel content that's voice ready, because, you know, spoken content is very different from written content, or should we go in the direction of keeping everything in one single source of truth and going along with what we already have and reusing content as much as possible? You know, the general thing I've noticed in the industry, and having worked with several different voice content clients before, and a lot of organizations in particular that don't have the luxury of having a full conversational team, is that a lot of these folks really want the latter. And I think that is more efficient. It's more effective in terms of actually allowing you to reuse your content in many different ways, and also reduce the maintenance burden of that content. Because I think one of the things that happens when you have parallel versions of content, and this is something I noticed in the past as well, is people would go and build these experiments, these really awesome, let's say, hackathon prototypes or proofs of concept that really delved into the possibilities for voice content. But as soon as it came down to actually thinking about how to maintain this content, they suddenly realized, oh, we have this separate database, this separate corpus of content over here that bears absolutely no relation or no relevance to our existing content. And we can't possibly ask our marketing organization or our customer experience teams to actually manage both versions of content. And this was actually one of the things that came up from my conversations with the Digital Services Georgia team when we built Ask Georgia Gov. They explicitly said to us, they said, you know, we have a very limited budget, being public sector in the United States. State governments are very cash strapped. And they said, we need to manage all of this content in one place. We can only manage one version of this content, and we can't reuse this we cannot have parallel versions of content. So we went through and we audited the content for them, helped them to make their content appropriate for both web and voice, which I think is a very useful exercise for any team that's looking to move beyond the web. But of course, I think it doesn't necessarily answer the question of you know, the differences that we see between short form and long form content, which is something I talk about extensively in the book. And I think one of the things that you can do is obviously to take a look at some of the content modeling conveniences that are built into a lot of content management systems to begin with. For example, a teaser or summary version of a blog post could be a far more appropriate version of that blog post for a voice interface than the actual full body text of that blog post. You know, by the same token, though, I think one of the things that's really important to keep in mind is that there is still a gap between spoken content and written content. And it's very difficult to reconcile those things and say, oh, we're just going to have this single version of content kind of paint the whole picture for everybody. There's some interesting things happening in that regard. It's not really very, you know, sort of developed yet. It's a very immature area. But one of the things that I think is really important for especially conversation designers and voice interface designers and chatbot designers to recognize that spoken content, spoken conversational interfaces are totally different from written content and written conversational interfaces. For example, you would never say the phrase, "to whom it may concern," when you talk to somebody. And chances are that we say the word literally far more often when we speak than when we actually write. And it's one of those things that I think is really important to keep in mind around the fact that there are some of these emerging platforms that are out there, like Bot Society, Dialogflow, that will allow you to build a single voice interface that you can deploy anywhere, whether it's to a chatbot or to a Facebook Messenger bot or to a Google Assistant. But of course, you have to be very careful about those things because there are certain nuances and differences. There are some interesting things that I think I would love to see in this regard. A very interesting service that has emerged in recent years is Amazon Polly. And Amazon Polly basically allows you to put in some chunks of text and it will read out that text to you in a variety of different voices for phone prompts or for certain applications you have. It's not necessarily a pure voice interface, but it is an interesting service that's available for people who need to kind of turn pieces of text into audio. One of the things I find missing from Amazon Polly and some of these interesting services that will transcribe, or I'm not sure what the correct term would be to translate into audio, but maybe transcribe. Yeah, but yeah, we'll see.
Is it? That's one of the common ones I hear.
Yeah, it's this terminology obviously is evolving, but I think one of the things that is really tough for me to see is there's still no service out there that can translate written text, or let's say web text, into spoken content or spoken text. For example, you probably don't want a very formal sounding and very formally written kind of page to be directly read aloud in a voice interface, because it's going to sound very stilted. It's going to sound very much like a college, a university lecture, right, as opposed to something that's more informal. So what I'm looking for, and this is something I'd love to see, is a means of translating algorithmically some of the content that we have written already into a means that can be more appropriate for spoken content, with more contractions, more colloquialisms, more of the kinds of things that we expect to hear from somebody who's speaking, so it doesn't sound like a robotic, aloof AI, which is, has always been the problem with AI and some of these voice assistants.
No, completely agree. And I think even what I realized when we were having this last piece of the conversation is, even now when we're speaking about voice, we're still trying to contextualize it a bit to the concept of web pages or an e-commerce product, but that won't always be the case, right? I mean, if you're tying content modeling to voice, it's not always going to be just taking your e-commerce website and making it a bit friendlier for an Alexa or a Google Home to recommend your product. But there's tons of other use cases. I mean, if just off the top of my head, if we look at the accessibility heavy ones like navigation and education, where it's not always a one-to-one to the digital product you were selling before, but there's this whole new level of considerations like location data, like giving people the right directions to get where they need to be when they can't just open an app or check out a website. So when we look at these additional use cases where you have accessibility, where you have the need to help your customers without necessarily tying it to commercial data, what are some of the sort of optimization considerations that you would have to think about? Because now it's not just, I have a website, I want this to be voice ready, but I have a website or I have a product and I need to add this extra layer or this level of interacting with my content that's not just a translation to voice. Is this something you've given thought to, or something you have an opinion on where teams can be a bit more accessibility friendly or optimize their content for these new layers of interaction?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's definitely a lot to unpack there. The first thing I will say is I'll focus on this topic of accessibility first, because I think it's very relevant to the reason why voice interfaces have gained such popularity. So with Georgia, for example, the Ask Georgia Gov project, one of the explicit motivations for building this first ever voice interface for residents of the state of Georgia was the state of Georgia's efforts to really improve accessibility outcomes and access for not only disabled Georgians, but also elderly Georgians, or those who are otherwise unable to access a computer or unable to access certain ways in which we navigate the web. And there's a lot of interesting insights into this that have been provided by accessibility advocates and accessibility specialists. And when you think about it, one of the really interesting things about this bias that we've been talking about towards the web and towards the visual is that it really manifests in very unexpected ways. One very good example of this is the screen reader. I use JAWS or Chromevox to test a lot of my websites and things that I work on. But a lot of these, let's say, some of the most commonly known examples of voice interfaces are screen readers. But of course, the problem with screen readers is that they're an oral interface. They're a verbal interface that's been built for a visual medium. And when you think about it, back in the day, you would test all of these, and still do, you would test all of these web pages in your screen reader, and you would have to sift through all of these things like, identifying certain images or identifying links and identifying, for example, the skip to main content link. And all of these things in accessibility are potentially an interesting way for voice interfaces to enter the picture. One example of this is Chris Maury, who's a blind technologist and has spoken on this problem many times. He himself has said, it never made sense to me why it was that screen readers were designed based on the visual strictures of websites, as opposed to people building accessible means for people to access their content in a more friendly conversational way. And he explicitly supports the idea that voice interfaces and voice assistants and pure voice interfaces can be used to help particularly blind and other disabled folks actually navigate some of these web pages that formerly were really serpentinely and labyrinthinely navigated through these screen readers. And Ask Georgia Gov is an example of this, right? Where what we found is that the kinds of people that were using that interface and the kinds of things they were looking for were very different from those on the website, which really indicates that you're attracting a very different demographic. You're getting access to a very different kind of audience when you enable some of these other channels beyond the web. Now, for some of the optimization considerations for other things, and I think one of the things you mentioned was navigation, things like in-car navigation. There's a whole lot of concern, obviously, about the notion that, well, when we start to move away from some of the things that are larger picture, what I call macro content or long-form content, into these short bursts of content, I think one of the things that we have to begin to think about is how do we semantically enrich our content? How do we structure our content in such a way at a more microcosmic level, at a more atomic level, that helps for these, let's say, short pepperings of content or short outlays of content that might bear little to no relation to the ways in which we structure our fields in our content model within the context of a CMS. And these are still very early days, and I absolutely agree that there isn't a good solution yet for this kind of slicing and dicing that a lot of people need, that doesn't necessarily, let's say, disrupt the kind of slicing and dicing we already do of our content for destinations like the website. We could probably talk about ideas around this and brainstorm around this for hours, I know, but it's a really interesting discussion there.
No, it's also partly because I'm personally curious, right? So when you think about content modeling and even breaking down your strategy into atomic content in a new format, it's more of a personal curiosity for me to see how this is reusable across different formats and in different ways. And I'll admit that me personally, I don't work with as many types of content yet, because at GraphCMS, we don't necessarily interact with voice and with other digital displays. So it was more curiosity to get your take on it more than anything else. But yeah, it's still a lot to unpack, and I agree there's tons more to be done here. There's tons more that we can talk about and see where things go. But maybe for now, just to wrap things up with this conversation, let's maybe end it with a bit of an easy one. So if you had to give your recommendation to any teams or companies who fall into that bucket of we've always done things this way, we don't necessarily need to optimize for voice, or we may never need to optimize for voice, what would your recommendation be there? If they're not willing to budge into new formats or think they don't need it, but might at some point, it's just that no one knows. What are some recommendations you would make here to be a bit more voice ready?
Sure. And I'll also share a little bit of insight, just a little bit more on that last question as well, just to wrap things up on that front. I think, so one of the things that I encourage, and this also applies to this final question as well, one thing I encourage all organizations to do is, if you're not ready to do something like an omnichannel content audit where you're looking at how your content can fit into different experiences, if you're not yet ready to think about any of these things, of course, despite the fact that over the course of the coronavirus pandemic, according to several analysts. McKinsey calls it the quickening. What we've seen is skyrocketing sales of not only things like these Alexa devices and Google Home devices, but also smart speakers, smart home systems, smart ovens, smart appliances, as well as, of course, a lot of these more, let's say, gaming-friendly devices like Oculus Rifts and HoloLenses. And I think over the next decade, especially by 2030, we're going to see a big change in the ways in which a lot of people consume their content, in much the same way we've seen a large change over the last 10 years in how people consume media through smart TVs and over-the-top boxes and things of that nature. But one recommendation I would make is, one thing we did for Georgia, right, is we said, hey, okay, this is more of just a little bit of a dipping of the toe into our next generation of content, and we're not ready to make a huge investment yet. And this is totally a fine position to be in. I think we're still very much at a certain early point in the hype curve when it comes to voice interfaces. But one of the recommendations I would have is take a look at your content and see what are some of the pieces of content that are voice-friendly or conversationally cadential that could potentially lend themselves to a potential voice interface or some form of experience that you might not have imagined. Because it's perfectly fine to take a subset of your content and apply that into a voice interface. And that's exactly what we did with Georgia. I talk about this, of course, in my book, where we took frequently asked questions, the specific FAQs that people were asking that were already well-oriented for a voice interface, and just took that chunk of content, that subset of content, as our focus for how we wanted to deliver content to this voice interface. That being said, however, I don't think it's ever too early to think about some of these ramifications of the technological quickening that's happening with a lot of these new devices emerging in consumer households, as well as, of course, the ways in which our CMSs are evolving as well, both at Oracle and GraphCMS, in order to achieve some of these really amazing milestones around some of the ways in which content will evolve. Because one thing I can tell you for sure is that within 5 to 10 years, we're going to be seeing a lot more brick and mortar stores begin to provide, let's say, pure voice interfaces that help people navigate through a dialogue-driven shopping experience. We're going to see much more of those brick and mortar shops manifesting in virtual reality headsets, because people are increasingly frightened to go into these public locations. And we're going to see a lot more of the sorts of content that we need to deliver really jump off the screen and enter into a world where things are very, very different. And I think one of the questions I would have to ask your to ask your stakeholders, to ask your executives, to ask your organization leaders is, well, what are we going to do when our competitors' content starts to speak for itself? Or when our competitors' content starts to be able to have a voice of its own, where are we going to fit into that really complex and nuanced picture? It's a very exciting time, and I think it's good to be early on the needle.
No, I think that's a fantastic point as well, because you don't want to wake up one day and find out that you're not competitive anymore. And at the end of the day, that's one of the biggest drivers to constantly innovate. So yeah, I love that take on things, and fun times ahead. There's so much you can do when you're delivering content API first. So I'm also excited to see where things land up in 5 to 10 years. But yeah, I guess that's a topic by itself. Well, yeah, Preston, thanks a lot so much for having this call. As always, love to hear everything you have to say. I'm going to pull your socials up on the screen right now. So if anyone does want to get in touch with you for anything to do with content or voice, feel free. Preston's got a ton of knowledge in the space. And well, I'm just unsoliciting it here, but I guess you'd be happy to talk about it at any time.
Absolutely, Ronak. It's been a real pleasure to be here with you today on the GraphCMS Talks. And please come to Decoupled Days, July 14th through 15th. It's free for the first and only time this year. It's probably going to be our only free edition. And of course, you can find much more about me, my book, as well as more of my writing on Preston So. And pre-order my new book, Voice, Content, and Usability, at abookapart.com. Thanks so much.
Sounds good. Speak soon, Preston. Bye.
Bye-bye.